I met Dr. Harker in a room that was too clean to feel safe. People say that like it's a metaphor. They mean the kind of clean that implies control. A place where nothing has ever been allowed to happen unless it was planned. His office sat on the 5th floor of a private clinic that advertised itself as discreet and progressive. No barred windows, no sharp corners, no institutional smell. A soft rug, a low couch, a little table with a carafe of water and glasses that looked too heavy to break. He was younger than I expected, mid-40s maybe. Sleeves rolled up like he was the type of man who believed that empathy was a form of hard labor. He had a calm face that wouldn't cause alarm in a crowded elevator. If you were building a predator to pass as a helper, you'd give him that face. I'm writing this now because the police will want timelines and evidence and motive, and I don't have much of any of that. What I have is the slow part, the part no one wants to hear, because it makes everything feel preventable. The part where the danger isn't a sudden shadow with a weapon. It's a professional smile and a chair positioned at a respectful angle. I was referred to him after my panic attacks got embarrassing. I had one at work during a meeting. Not the dramatic kind. No fainting, no crying. Just the quiet horror of losing my breath while everyone else spoke in normal voices. My hands went numb. The room tilted. I had to excuse myself to a bathroom stall where I sat on the floor and waited to return to the species. My manager was kind and told me she'd cover for me if I needed time off. She also emailed me 3 different clinic recommendations and phrased it as support. I picked Dr. Harker because his website didn't have stock photos of people laughing in parks. His specialty was complex anxiety and identity consolidation. Identity consolidation. I didn't know what that meant, but it sounded expensive and confident. The first session went well. That's important to say because I need you to understand that nothing about him triggered the usual warning system. He asked routine questions. Sleep, appetite, history, family. He didn't rush me. He didn't fake softness. If anything, he felt pleasantly blunt. He had a way of making silence feel like a tool instead of a threat. When I paused, he didn't pounce. He waited like he knew I'd come back with something worth hearing. At the end, he said, "I think you're exhausted by hypervigilance. You've trained yourself to anticipate disaster. That's not your fault, but it's becoming your identity." I remember nodding like a student who's been praised. He gave me exercises that weren't insulting. Breathing techniques I could do without feeling like I was pretending to be calm. Notes on how to map triggers. A short book recommendation. He didn't diagnose me too quickly, which made me trust him more. I left thinking I'd found someone solid. You can probably guess the rest. But it didn't arrive in a straight line. It came in revisions. Around the 4th session, he introduced a concept he called clean fear. He said most people imagine fear as a screaming alarm, but clean fear was surgical. It was fear that didn't waste energy on spectacle. He spoke about it like a craftsman. Some anxieties are irrational, he said. Some are misdirected, but some are accurate perceptions of risk that your body wants you to respect. The trick is separating the noise from the signal. It sounded wise. It sounded like the kind of thing you'd quote to friends over dinner. He asked me to keep a different kind of journal. Not just what scared me, but what kind of fear it was. Is it a warning? He asked. Or is it a story your mind tells to keep you busy? I did it because I wanted to get better. I wanted the world to feel normal again. Soon the journal entries got longer, not because my fears grew, but because he kept asking for more detail. The physical sensations, the images that came up, the earliest memory of that sensation. He liked specifics. When I said I feel unsafe sometimes, he'd look at me like I'd given him a lazy snack. Unsafe how? Unsafe from what? Which version of you is unsafe? I thought he was just thorough. There are certain kinds of questions that feel deep because they make you work. I told him about my apartment building, how the hallway lights sometimes flickered and made the place feel like a cheap horror set. I told him about the widow on the second floor who used to wander the lobby at night and ask if anyone had seen her husband. I told him about my father too, because you always end up there. My father wasn't violent. He was worse. He was absent in a way that made you question your reality. He'd promised to pick me up from school, and then not arrive and not call. If I asked later, he'd shrug like he couldn't remember agreeing to anything. It taught me to rehearse disappointment. Dr. Harker listened. He didn't demonize my father. He didn't diagnose him from a distance. He wasn't that kind of therapist, he said. He was the kind who wanted to talk about me. Your brain, he said, learned that care is unreliable. So now you preemptively distrust stability. It's an adaptive strategy that has outlived its usefulness. I felt seen. Then he said something I didn't fully understand until later. When a system learns a rule that keeps you alive, it doesn't relinquish that rule politely. You have to replace it with something stronger. I nodded. I think I even smiled. The first red flag was so small that I'm embarrassed to call it one. He asked me to switch my sessions to later hours. Your schedule seems tight, he said. We'll get better traction if we meet when you're not rushing. I agreed. It meant leaving work a little early, then coming back online from home to finish emails. It was annoying but manageable. The clinic was quieter in the evenings. The reception staff changed. The waiting room felt like a hotel lobby after everyone has gone to bed. One night I arrived early and sat by the tall window overlooking the street. A man in a security uniform was speaking to the receptionist. They seemed tense. The man kept glancing toward the hall that led to the offices. I thought it was none of my business. When the man left, I asked the receptionist if everything was okay. She hesitated and then said, "We had to update some protocols." That was all. An hour later, Dr. Harker began our session as if nothing had happened. I mentioned the security guard. He hummed in acknowledgement. We had a former patient show up last week. He was distressed. Was anyone hurt? No, he said. But sometimes we need to remind people that boundaries are real. He said it gently, professionally, but there was something in the finality that stuck to my ribs. The second red flag was also small. He asked me about trust in a way that felt rehearsed, not the obvious kind. Not, "Do you trust me?" More like, when someone looks calm, do you assume they are safe? When someone speaks gently, do you assume they are honest? When someone has authority, do you assume they will use it for you? He asked those questions like someone building a profile. I answered anyway. I'm not stupid. I just hadn't learned that respect can be weaponized with clinical precision. By the sixth session, he introduced exposure work. He wanted me to confront the most specific versions of my fear. I told him my worst recurring scenario: being trapped in a situation where the person in charge was unstable or cruel, and no one believed me. I didn't say it that cleanly. I said it through examples. Bosses, teachers, landlords, all the little gods of everyday life. He nodded as if I'd finally given him something he'd been waiting for. Then we should work directly with that, he said. Not hypothetically, experientially. I asked what that meant. It means we simulate vulnerability, he said, in a safe container, so your nervous system learns a new outcome. The language was so polished I let it wash over me. He proposed we do one session in a different room, a smaller office used for assessments. He said it had fewer distractions. The assessment room was down a back hallway. No rug, no art, just 2 chairs and a desk. The door shut with a heavier sound. I noticed a camera in the corner. He saw me looking. It's for safety. Standard practice. Do you record? Only if there's cause. I felt silly for checking. I started to change in ways that I thought were progress. I stopped apologizing so much. I spoke more directly. I kept my journal. I slept a little better. He praised that. He said, "You're becoming less porous." I like that word, porous. It made me feel like a structure that was solidifying. Then he asked me to share my journal, not excerpts, the whole thing. "Your writing is honest," he said. "It will help me make a better map of your patterns." I hesitated. He waited. That was his gift. He could make you feel that your reluctance was the real symptom. I handed it over. He didn't read it in front of me. He took it home. He gave it back in the next session with sticky tabs marking sections. He'd underlined sentences and written notes in the margins. I should have been angry. It felt intimate in a way I hadn't agreed to. But he framed it as collaboration. "This is good work," he said. "You're braver on paper than you are out loud." I laughed nervously. He smiled. That smile was almost affectionate. Almost. The first time he scared me. He did it without raising his voice. We were talking about the fear of being disbelieved. He asked me to describe a time in childhood when I knew something was wrong but couldn't prove it. I told him about my father's lies, the missing pickups, the way he made me feel dramatic for expecting him to show up. Dr. Harker listened with his elbows on his knees, appearing invested. When I finished, he said, "How do you know those events happened the way you remember?" I blinked. I remember them. "Memory is reconstructive," he said. "You know that." "Sure, but your father may not have been malicious. You might have projected your anxiety onto normal lapses." I felt heat in my face. "Are you saying I imagined years of him not showing up?" "I'm saying the certainty in your narrative may be part of your disorder." He said it calmly, like a scientist noting a lab result. I sat there trying to speak and not wanting to. This was not about my father. I could feel that. This was about something else. About him seeing whether he could move the floor under my feet. I forced myself to say, "That feels invalidating." Good, he said. I stared at him. That feeling, he continued, is your body recognizing an old wound. We can use it. I didn't know what to do with that. It was clever. He turned my discomfort into proof of his method. I told myself that therapy was supposed to be challenging. I told myself a lot of things. After that, I began to notice the clinic staff avoiding his hallway. Nothing overt, just small movements. The way a receptionist would choose a longer route to deliver papers. The way another doctor would not meet his eyes in the kitchen area where the coffee machine was. One night I came out of a session and heard muffled crying near the supply closet. I slowed down. The sound stopped. A nurse stepped out, smiling too quickly. Everything okay? I asked. Yep. Long day. I wanted to believe her. The patient who changed everything for me was a woman named Celia. I met her in the waiting room. We were the only two people there, both sitting in chairs angled away from each other, as if we'd been taught to keep our illnesses private. She was in her late 20s, with a careful posture and a jaw that looked tired. We made the kind of small talk people make when they're trying to convince themselves they are normal. She asked who I saw. I told her. Her face changed in a blink. Not horror, not shock. Recognition. Like someone who hears a name they were hoping never to hear again. Oh, she said softly. What? Nothing. I should have let it go. Instead, I laughed awkwardly and said, He's intense, but I think he's helping. She looked down at her hands. I used to see him, she said. Used to? She nodded. There was a small bruise on the inside of her wrist, yellowing at the edges. I noticed it because it didn't look accidental. She followed my gaze and pulled her sleeve down. I switched providers, she said. It was not a fit. What happened? Her mouth tightened. I don't think you should ask that in a waiting room. I dropped it. Then my door opened and Dr. Harker stepped out. His eyes went to Celia for half a second. That half second was enough. It was a look you give someone you've already decided you control. Celia looked away. He smiled at me. Come in. I stood. As I closed the door behind me, I told myself I was reading too much into it. That night, he was different. Not harsher, not kinder. Focused, like he'd made a decision. He asked me about my social life, which was unusual. Friends, dating, co-workers. I said I was close with my sister. I mentioned her name and the city she lived in. He said, Do you share the work we do here with her? Sometimes, not in detail. Good. I laughed, thinking it was a joke. He didn't laugh back. Therapy, he said, is a controlled environment. When you bring outsiders into it, you contaminate the process. That word again. Control. I asked, Isn't support a good thing? Support is useful, he said, when it doesn't undermine the treatment plan. It was such a small sentence. It ended up swallowing months of my life. 2 days later, Celia was gone. I don't mean she wasn't in the waiting room. I mean she stopped existing in any traceable way. I looked her up on the clinic's patient portal page out of curiosity. I knew it was weird to do, but her reaction had unsettled me. No record. I searched social media. Her accounts were still there, but quiet. I sent a message to her Instagram that sat unread. I told myself she'd just moved on. I told myself that because the alternative was too big. In our next session, I asked Dr. Harker if he'd had a patient named Celia. I tried to sound casual. His face did not change. "We have many patients," he said. "I just meant she mentioned you." "What is her last name?" I hesitated. "I don't know." "Then I can't comment." That should have been the end of it. But he added something. "If she was speaking about me to other patients, that's a breach of boundaries." He said it with mild disappointment, like a teacher noticing a student cheat. I felt myself shift into apology. "Oh, I didn't mean." "I know you didn't," he said. And there it was again. The calm hand on the back of your neck. The next phase of therapy, he said, required environmental restructuring. He wanted me to get rid of items in my apartment that were tied to old identities. Clothes I wore during bad periods. Objects from my childhood. Photos that freeze you in a narrative of victimhood. It wasn't unreasonable advice in theory, but his list was very specific. He asked about a particular framed photo I had mentioned once, the one of me and my sister at a beach when we were teenagers. "I want you to take that down," he said. I laughed, confused. "Why that?" "Because you idealize her as your rescuer," he said. "It keeps you immature." That was such a harsh word for something so small. I didn't want to argue. So I did it. I took the photo down. I put it in a box. Then later I found myself unable to remember where I'd put the box. I'm not saying he was in my apartment. I'm saying that when someone teaches you to doubt your own meaning, losing track of your living space starts to feel normal. It got worse after I missed a session. I had a work emergency. I emailed the clinic and asked to reschedule. I expected a polite reply. Instead, I got a phone call from Dr. Harker himself. "I'm concerned," he said. "It was just work," I told him. "You're avoiding." "I'm not." "Your pattern is to rationalize fear as responsibility." I felt myself shrinking. He said, "I'm going to book you a double session this week." "A double session?" "You need containment." I should have said no. I said yes. The double session was in the assessment room. The difference this time, he locked the door. He did it smoothly, like it was a reflex. I stared at the lock. He said, "This is an exposure exercise." "To what?" "To the feeling of not having immediate escape." My mouth went dry. "I didn't agree to that." "You agreed to treatment." "That's not the same thing." He watched me. I felt like a dog being evaluated for how hard it would bite. Then he said, "If you leave now, you'll reinforce the belief that you're unsafe with authority. You'll fail yourself." It was a perfect sentence. It put the burden on me. It made staying feel like strength. So I stayed. For 2 hours. He asked me to describe the worst things a person in power could do. He asked me to imagine, in detail, what it would feel like to be trapped with someone who smiled while he hurt me. He told me to keep my voice steady. He took notes. When I started crying, he didn't interrupt. When I stopped, he said, "Good. Your system is tolerating reality." I walked out of that room dizzy and ashamed. I told myself it was breakthrough pain. That night I called my sister. I hadn't planned to. It just happened. I told her therapy had gotten intense. I didn't name the locked door. I didn't mention the way he'd used my fear like material. I just said I was tired. She asked for his full name. I gave it. A week later, she called me back and said she couldn't find much about him outside the clinic site and an old academic bio. "Is that normal?" she asked. "It's a private practice," I said. "That doesn't mean he should be invisible." I snapped at her. I hate that I did. I told her she didn't understand mental health care. I said it was none of her business. After we hung up, I felt sick. That conversation is one of the things I can't forgive myself for. The next session, Dr. Harker asked if I had talked to anyone about our work. I paused. He smiled as if we were sharing a private joke. I said, "Not really." He let the lie float in the air. Then he said, "Good." I didn't know that lying to him would become its own form of therapy. I found out what happened to Celia through a mistake. A receptionist I hadn't seen before was covering the desk at the end of a late shift. She looked new enough to still have feelings. When I checked in, I saw a folder on the counter. Celia's name was on a printed label. I felt a rush of cold. I said, "Oh, I know her." The receptionist looked relieved to have a normal human interaction. "Then you might want to call her," she said quietly. "Why?" She hesitated. "We're not supposed to talk about it. I just want to know if she's okay." The receptionist swallowed. "She left an emergency contact note," she said. "But it didn't go anywhere." "What note?" The receptionist glanced down the hallway like the walls might be wired. "She asked us to file a record about an incident. Something about Dr. Harker. The clinic administrator said it was a misunderstanding and closed it." My heart hammered. "An incident?" "I don't know the details. I'm sorry." Then Dr. Harker's door opened. The receptionist shut down her face into professionalism like flipping a switch. I felt trapped in a cartoonish way, caught mid-crime with my hand in the cookie jar. He looked at me kindly. "Come in." I walked. He didn't mention Celia. Instead, he asked me to do a new exercise. "Tonight," he said, "I want you to practice radical honesty." "With who?" "With yourself. With me." He leaned forward. "Tell me what you think of me." It was the most intimate question he'd ever asked. I tried to dodge. "I think you're committed." He smiled. "That's polite. Try again." I felt sweat under my arms. I said, "Sometimes I feel pressured." "By what?" "By the pace. Does that feel unsafe?" I didn't answer. He nodded slowly. "Say the word unsafe out loud." "No." He tilted his head. "Why not?" Because I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of turning my fear into another tool. Because I was starting to see the shape of him. I said, "I don't like this." He sat back. For the first time, his face dropped a little of its mask. Not rage, something thinner, disappointment that looked like contempt. Your progress, he said, requires surrender of defensive pride. I wanted to leave. I stood. He didn't stop me. That was worse. I walked out with my legs shaking. The next morning, my manager called me into a meeting. She was careful, the way people are when they've been given a script. She said HR had received a concern about my stability, not from the clinic, from an anonymous source. The concern said I was experiencing paranoia, fixating on authority figures, misinterpreting neutral behavior as threat, and that I might be at risk of escalating a grievance. The language was clinical, too clinical. I felt my blood leave my face. I asked who filed it. She said they couldn't tell me. I asked what it was based on. She said they had supporting context. I left that meeting holding myself together with pure rage. I called the clinic. I asked to speak to the administrator. I was told she was unavailable. I asked to leave a message. The receptionist said, "Dr. Harker will address your concerns in session." It felt like being guided back into a trap. I didn't go to my next session. I emailed a termination note. Short, professional. He replied within 10 minutes. He wrote, "You are regression prone when confronted with truth. You'll struggle to find another clinician willing to tolerate your level of resistance. If you want to avoid the reputational consequences of a destabilizing exit, return for a closing session where we can frame your progress appropriately." It was the most threatening email I have ever read that contained no explicit threat. I stared at the screen. I showed it to my sister. She said, "This is coercive." I said, "Maybe he's just blunt." She said, "You don't sound like yourself." I started crying in my kitchen. I couldn't stop. 2 nights later, someone rang my doorbell. I wasn't expecting anyone. I checked the peephole. No one there. I opened the door anyway, because I'm still apparently an idiot. A small padded envelope sat on my welcome mat. Inside was my journal, the one I had given him months ago. I hadn't realized he still had copies of pages. A sticky note was placed on top. In his neat handwriting, "You wanted to feel safe. Safety is not the same as innocence." That was all. No signature, no letterhead, just a sentence that felt like a fingerprint. I sat on the floor with the journal in my lap and tried to decide whether I was overreacting. That is what he had taught me to do. I went to the police with the email and the note. They were polite. They asked if he had threatened me. Not exactly. They asked if he had been in my apartment. I couldn't prove it. They asked if I had a restraining order. Number. They told me to block his number and contact the clinic administration. I left feeling stupid and small and exactly like the child he had trained me to become. The next part is where people will start deciding whether they believe me. A week after I quit therapy, Celia's account finally opened my message and replied with one sentence. "He is not a psychiatrist." That was it. I stared at it until my eyes ached. I replied immediately. "What do you mean?" No response. I tried again later. "Are you safe?" Nothing. I called her through the app. It rang twice and went dead. I did my own search, not social media. records, the medical board's public registry. I typed his name. Nothing. I typed variations. Still nothing. I searched the clinic's corporate filings. His name was listed as a clinical consultant, not a license number, not a credential. A role you could give to someone with a good suit and a talent for sounding certain. I called the clinic and asked to verify his license. The receptionist transferred me to voicemail. I left a message. No one called me back. 3 days later, the clinic website updated. Dr. Harker's profile was gone. No explanation. Just a missing page. Like he'd been a bad line of code quietly deleted. I drove there after work. I don't know what I thought I would do. The reception area was under renovation. Plastic sheets, boxes, a printed sign that said they were temporarily reducing services. I asked for the administrator. A man I'd never seen before came out and told me Dr. Harker was no longer with the clinic. I asked why. He said, "I can't discuss personnel changes." I asked if there had been complaints. He said, "If you have concerns, submit them in writing." I asked where Harker had gone. He said, "I don't know." He lied too smoothly. That night, my sister texted me a screenshot of a local news post. A woman had been found dead in a rented apartment 2 neighborhoods away. Cause of death was not released. The comments were the usual junk. But the woman's name was Celia. I couldn't breathe. I called my sister. I asked her to read the article out loud because my vision was blurring. There were no details. Just that authorities were investigating and asking anyone with information to come forward. I sat on my couch and tried to understand something that didn't want to be understood. The police took my statement more seriously after that. They asked about my sessions. They asked about the locked door. They asked about the email. I told them everything. The detective listened without interrupting. At the end, she said, "We have other reports." I said, "How many?" She didn't answer. Here is the last thing I need you to know. The night after I gave my statement, I got another envelope. This one was thicker. Inside was a printed transcript, a therapy session. My voice rendered into text. I don't know whether he'd recorded me in the assessment room or somewhere else. I don't know how many sessions he had archives of. But in the transcript, one line was highlighted. A moment when I had said, "I'm scared that someone can look kind and still want to hurt you." Below that, in the margin, he had typed, "You're learning." Then, at the end of the transcript, a single sentence. "If you want to be believed, you'll need to be predictable." That was the first time I understood what he was doing. He wasn't just hurting people. He was building records that made them look unstable. He was teaching them to doubt themselves. He was collecting their worst thoughts and arranging them like evidence. He didn't need to kill everyone he targeted. He just had to kill the version of them that others would trust. I slept at my sister's place after that. I left my apartment empty. I changed my route to work. I told HR I was being harassed by a former provider. I sent them the email. They believed me more than I expected. Maybe because of Celia. Maybe because my fear now had paperwork. The police eventually found him. Not in a dramatic standoff. not on a rooftop, not in a basement full of trophies. He was in another clinic across the city, under a different name, wearing the same careful face. He was listed as a consultant again. When they arrested him, he didn't struggle. The detective told me he asked for a glass of water and thanked them for their professionalism. That detail made me nauseous. I wish I could end this with relief. But the truth is, the worst part of someone like him isn't the violence. It's the doubt he leaves behind. Even now, even as I write this, I keep waiting for a voice in my head to say I'm exaggerating, that I misread everything, that I'm making a story out of discomfort. I think that was his most durable skill. He didn't just pick victims. He cultivated witnesses who would hesitate. I testified at the preliminary hearing. I watched him sit at the defense table in a suit that looked identical to the one he wore in session. He looked smaller there, less godlike, just a man. When our eyes met, he didn't glare. He didn't smirk. He gave me the same gentle, attentive expression that had made me trust him in the first place. As if he was still listening. As if this was just another exercise. As if I was still on his couch and he was about to tell me that my reaction was a pattern we could use. I broke eye contact first. I will always hate that. They say there may be more victims. They say many of his files were encrypted. They say he used NDA-like consent forms that the clinics never legally should have allowed. They say a lot of things. What I know is simpler. I know that evil doesn't always arrive with chaos. Sometimes it arrives with credentials printed in clean fonts. Sometimes it arrives with a soothing voice and a locked door explained as treatment. Sometimes it arrives as the person you ask for help. And if you're like me, you'll spend a long time trying to prove that a calm man can still be a killer. Because the scariest part isn't that he hurt people. The scariest part is how easy it was for him to make us help him do it to ourselves.